The second day, Monday, May 29th, 1944. Chapter 6. Data Frank drove through the night in the big Hispano Suiza, accompanied by his young assistant, Lieutenant Hans Hees. The car was 10 years old, but its massive 11-liter engine was tireless. Yesterday evening, Dieter had found a neat row of bullet holes stitched in the generous curve of its offside fender, a souvenir of the skirmish in the square at Santa Cecile. But there was no mechanical damage, and he felt the holes added to the car's glamour, like a dueling scar on the cheek of a Prussian officer. Lieutenant Hess masked the headlights to drive through the blacked-out streets of Paris, then removed the covers when they got on the road to Normandy. They took turns at the wheel, 2 hours each. Though Hess, who adored the car and hero-worshipped its owner, would gladly have driven the whole way. Half asleep in the passenger seat, mesmerized by the country roads unwinding in the headlights, Dieter tried to picture his future. Would the Allies reconquer France, driving the occupying forces out? The thought of Germany defeated was dismal. Perhaps there would be some kind of peace settlement, with Germany surrendering France and Poland, but keeping Austria and Czechoslovakia. That seemed not much better. He found it hard to imagine everyday life back in Cologne, with his wife and family, after the excitement and sensual indulgence of Paris and Stephanie. The only happy ending for Dieter and for Germany would be for Rommel's army to push the invaders back into the sea. Before dawn of a damp morning, Hess drove into the small medieval village of La Roche-Guyon, on the Seine River between Paris and Rouen. He stopped at the roadblock at the edge of the village, but they were expected and were quickly waved on. They went past silent, shuttered houses to another checkpoint at the gates of the ancient castle. At last they parked in the great cobbled courtyard. Dieter left Hess with the car and went into the building. The German commander-in-chief west was Field Marshal Gerd von Rothenstedt, a reliable senior general from the old officer class. Under him, charged with the defense of the French coast, was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The castle of La Roche-Guyon was Rommel's headquarters. Dieter Frank felt an affinity with Rommel. Both were the sons of teachers. Rommel's father had been a headmaster, and consequently both had felt the icy breath of German military snobbery from such men as von Rothenstedt. But otherwise, they were very different. Dieter was a sybarite, enjoying all the cultural and sensual pleasures France had to offer. Rommel was an obsessive worker, who did not smoke or drink, and often forgot to eat. He had married the only girlfriend he had ever had, and he wrote to her 3 times a day. In the hall, Dita met Rommel's aide-de-camp, Major Walter Gurdel, a colder personality with a formidable brain. Dita respected him, but could never liked him. They had spoken on the phone late last night. Data had outlined the problem he was having with the Gestapo, and said he wanted to see Rommel's as soon as possible. Be here at 4 a.m. Gordel had said. Rommel was always at his desk by 4 o'clock in the morning. Now Data wondered if he had done the right thing. Rommel might say, "How dare you bother me with trivial details?" Data thought not. Commanders like to feel they were on top of the details. Rommel would almost certainly give Dita the support he was asking for, but he could never be sure, especially when the commander was under strain. Gordel nodded a curt greeting and said, "He wants to see you right now. Come this way." As they walked along the hallway, Dita said, "What do you want here from Italy?" "Nothing but bad news," Gordel said. "We are withdrawing from Erkis." Dita gave a resigned nod. The Germans were fighting fiercely, but they had been depressingly unable to halt the northward advance of the enemy. A moment later, Dita entered Rommel's office. It was a grand room on the ground floor. Dita noticed with envy a priceless 17th century Gobelin tapestry on one wall. There was little furniture but for a few chairs and a huge antique desk that looked to Dita as if it might be the same age as the tapestry. On the desk stood a single lamp. Behind the desk sat a small man with receding sandy hair. Gordel said, "Major Frank is here, Field Marshal." Dita waited nervously. Rommel continued reading for a few seconds, then made a mark on the sheet of paper. He might have been a bank manager, reviewing the accounts of his more important customers. Until he looked up. Dita had seen the face before, but it never failed to make him feel threatened. It was a boxer's face, with a flat nose and a broad chin, and close-set eyes, and it was suffused with the naked aggression that had made Rommel's a legendary commander. Dita recalled the story of Rommel's first military engagement during the First World War. Leading an advance guard of 3 men, Rommel had come upon a group of 20 French troops. Instead of retreating and calling for reinforcements, Rommel had opened fire and dashed at the enemy. He had been lucky to survive, but Dita recalled Napoleon's dictum, "Send my lucky generals." Since then, Rommel had always favored the sudden, bold assault over the cautious, planned advance. In that he was the polar opposite of his desert opponent, Montgomery, whose philosophy was never to attack until you were certain of victory. "Sit down, Frank," said Rommel briskly. "What's on your mind?" Dita had rehearsed this. "On your instructions, I've been visiting key installations that might be vulnerable to attack by the resistance and upgrading their security." "Good. I've also been trying to assess the potential of the resistance to inflict serious damage. Can they really hamper our response to an invasion? And your conclusions? The situation is worse than we imagined. Rommel grunted with distaste, as if an unpleasant suspicion had been confirmed. Reasons. Rommel was not going to bite his head off. Dido relaxed a little. He recounted yesterday's attack at Santa Cecile. The imaginative planning, the plentiful weaponry, and most of all, the bravery of the fighters. The only detail he left out was the beauty of the blonde girl. Rommel stood up and walked across to the tapestry. He stared at it, but Dido was sure he did not see it. I was afraid of this, Rommel said. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. I can beat off an invasion, even with the few troops I have, if only I can remain mobile and flexible. But if my communications fail, I am lost. Godel nodded agreement. Dieter said, I believe we can turn the attack on the telephone exchange into an opportunity. Rommel turned to him with a wry smile. By God, I wish all my officers were like you. Go on. How will you do this? Data began to feel the meeting was going his way. If I can interrogate the captured prisoners, they may lead me to other groups. With luck, we might inflict a lot of damage on the resistance before the invasion. Rommel looked skeptical. That sounds like bragging. Dieter's heart sank. Then Rommel went on. If anyone else said it, I might send him packing. But I remember your work in the desert. You got men to tell you things they hardly realized they knew. Dieter was pleased. Sizing his advantage, he said, Unfortunately, the Gestapo is refusing me access to the prisoners. They are such imbeciles. I need you to intervene. Of course. Rommel looked at Godel. Call Avenue Foch. The Gestapo's French headquarters was at 84 Avenue Foch in Paris. Tell them that Major Franck will interrogate the prisoners today, or their next phone call will come from Berchtesgaden. He was referring to Hitler's Bavarian fortress. Rommel never hesitated to use the field marshal's privilege of direct access to Hitler. Very good, said Godel. Rommel walked around his 17th century desk and sat down again. Keep me informed, please, Franck, he said, and returned his attention to his papers. Dieter and Godel left the room. Godel walked Dieter to the main door of the castle. Outside it was still dark. Chapter 7. Flick landed at Ralph Tempsford, an airstrip 50 miles north of London, near the village of Sandy in Bedfordshire. She would have known just from the cool, damp taste of the night air in her mouth that she was back in England. She loved France, but this was home. Walking across the airfield, she remembered coming back from holidays as a child. Her mother would always say the same thing as the house came into view. It's nice to go away, but it's nice to come home. The things her mother said came back to her at the oddest moments. A young woman in the uniform of a Fanny Corporal was waiting with a powerful Jaguar to drive her to London. "This is luxurious," Flick said as she settled into the leather seat. "I'm to take you directly to Orchard Court," the driver said. "They're waiting to debrief you." Flick rubbed her eyes. "Christ," she said feelingly. "Do they think we don't need sleep?" The driver did not respond to that. Instead, she said, "I hope the mission went well, Major." "It was a snafu." "I beg pardon?" "Snafu," Flick repeated. "It's an acronym. It stands for Situations Normal All Fucked Up." The woman fell silent. Flick guessed she was embarrassed. It was nice, she thought ruefully, that there were still girls to whom the language of the barracks was shocking. Dawn broke as the fast car sped through the Hertfordshire villages of Stevenage and Nebworth. Flick looked out at the modest houses with vegetables growing in the front gardens. The country post offices were grumpy postmistresses resentfully doled out penny stamps, and the assorted pubs with their warm beer and battered pianos. And she felt profoundly grateful for that the Nazis had not got this far. The feeling made her all the more determined to return to France. She wanted another chance to attack the chateau. She pictured the people she had left behind at Saint-Cecile, Albert, young Bertrand, beautiful Genevieve, and the others dead or captured. She thought of their families, distraught with worry or stunned by grief. She resolved that their sacrifices should not have been fruitless. She would have to start right away. It was a good thing she was to be debriefed immediately. She would have a chance to propose her new plan today. The men who ran SOE would be wary at first, for no one had ever sent an all-female team on such a mission. There were all sorts of snags, but there were always snags. By the time they reached the North London suburbs, it was full daylight, and the special people of the early morning were out and about. Postmen and milkmen making their deliveries, train drivers and bus conductors walking to work. The signs of war were everywhere. A poster warning against waste, a notice in a butcher's window saying, "No meat today," a woman driving a rubbish cart, a whole row of small houses bombed into rubble. But no one here would stop Flick and demand to see her papers, and put her in a cell and torture her for information, then send her in a cattle truck to a camp where she would starve. She felt the high-voltage tension of living under cover drain slowly out of her, and she slumped in the car seat and closed her eyes. She woke up when the car turned into Baker Street and went past number 64. Agents were kept out of the headquarters building so that they could not reveal its secrets under interrogation. Indeed, many agents did not know its address. The car turned into Portman Square and stopped outside Orchard Court, an apartment building. The driver sprang out to hold the door open. Flick went inside and made her way to SOE's flat. Her spirits lifted when she saw Percy Throt, a balding man of 50 with a toothbrush mustache. He was paternally fond of Flick. He wore civilian clothing, and neither of them saluted, for SOE was impatient of military formalities. I can tell by your face that it went badly, Percy said. His sympathetic tone of voice was too much for Flick to bear. The tragedy of what had happened overwhelmed her suddenly, and she burst into tears. Percy put his arms around her and patted her back. She buried her face in his old tweed jacket. "All right," he said. "I know you did your best." "Oh God, I'm sorry to be such a girl. I wish all my men were such girls," Percy said, with a catch in his voice. She detached herself from his embrace and wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "Take no notice." He turned away and blew his nose into a big handkerchief. "Tea or whiskey?" he said. "Tea, I think." She looked around. The room was full of shabby furniture, hastily installed in 1940 and never replaced. A cheap desk, a worn rug, mismatched chairs. She sank into a sagging armchair. "I'll fall asleep if I have booze." She watched Percy as he made tea. He could be tough as well as compassionate. Much decorated in the First World War, he had become a rabble-rousing labor organizer in the 20s and was a veteran of the 1936 Battle of Cable Street, when Cockneys attacked fascists who were trying to march through a Jewish neighborhood in London's East End. He would ask searching questions about her plan, but he would be open-minded. He handed her a mug of tea with milk and sugar. "There's a meeting later this morning," he said. "I have to get a briefing note to the boss by 9 Emma. Hence the hurry." She sipped the sweet tea and felt a pleasant jolt of energy. She told him what had happened in the square at Santa Cecile. He sat at the desk and made notes with a sharp pencil. "I should have called it off," she finished, "based on Internet's misgivings about the intelligence. I should have postponed the raid and sent you a radio message saying we were outnumbered." Percy shook his head sadly. "This is no time for postponements. The invasion can't be more than a few days away. If you had consulted us, I doubt it would have made any difference." "What could we do? We couldn't send you more men. I think we would have ordered you to go ahead regardless. It had to be tried. The telephone exchange is too important." "Well, that's some consolation." Flick was glad she did not have to believe Albert had died because she had made a tactical error. But that would not bring him back. "And Michaels is all right," Percy said, mortified but recovering. When SOE had recruited Flick, she had not told them her husband was in the resistance. If they had known, they might have steered her toward different work. But she had not really known it herself, though she had guessed. In May 1940, she had been in England visiting her mother, and Miguel had been in the army like most able-bodied young Frenchmen, so the fall of France had left them stranded in different countries. By the time she returned as a secret agent and learned for certain what role her husband was playing, too much training had been invested in her, and she was already too useful to SOE for her to be fired on account of hypothetical emotional distractions. Everyone hates a bullet in the backside, Pussy mused. People think you must have been running away. He stood up. Well, you'd better go home and get some sleep. Not yet, Flick said. First, I want to know what we're going to do next. I'm going to write this report. No, I mean about the telephone exchange. If it's so important, we have to knock it out. He sat down again and looked at her shrewdly. What have you got in mind? She took Internet's pass out of her bag and threw it on his desk. Here's a better way to get inside. That's used by the cleaners who go in every night at 7 o'clock. Percy picked up the pass and scrutinized it. Clever girl, he said, with something like admiration in his voice. Get on. I want to go back. A look of pain passed briefly over Percy's face, and Flick knew he was dreading her risking her life again. But he said nothing. This time, I'll take a full team with me. She went on. Each of them will have a pass like that. We'll substitute for the cleaners in order to get into the chateau. I take it the cleaners are women. Yes, I'd need an all-female team. He nodded. Not many people around here will object to that. You girls have proved yourselves. But where would you find the women? Virtually all our trained people are over there already. Get approval for my plan, and I'll find the woman. I'll take SOE rejects. People who failed the training course. Anybody. We must have a file of people who have dropped out for one reason or another. Yes, because they were physically unfit, or couldn't keep their mouths shut, or enjoyed violence too much, or lost their nerve in parachute training and refused to jump out of the plane. It doesn't matter if they're second-raters, Flick argued earnestly. I can deal with that. At the back of her mind, a voice said, Can you really? But she ignored it. If the invasion fails, we've lost Europe. We won't try again for years. This is the turning point. We have to throw everything at the enemy. You couldn't use French women who are already there, resistance fighters. Flick had already considered and rejected that idea. If I had a few weeks, I might put together a team from women in half a dozen different resistance circuits. But it would take too long to find them and get them to Reims. It might still be possible. And then we have to have a forged pass with a photo for each woman. That's hard to arrange over there. Here, we can do it in a day or two. It's not that easy. Pussy held Internet's pass up to the light of a naked bulb hanging from the ceiling. But you're right. Our people do work miracles in that department. He put it down. All right. It has to be SOE rejects then. Flick felt a surge of triumph. He was going for it. Percy went on. But assuming you can find enough French-speaking girls, will it work? What about the German guards? Don't they know the cleaners? It's probably not the same woman every night. They must have days off, and men never notice who cleans up after them. I'm not sure. Soldiers are generally sex-hungry youngsters who pay great attention to all the women with whom they come into contact. I imagine the men in this chateau flirt with the younger ones at least. I watched these women entering the chateau last night, and I didn't see any signs of flirting. Still, you can't be sure the men won't notice the appearance of a completely strange crew. I can't be certain, but I'm confident enough to take the chance. All right, what about the French people inside? The telephone operators are local women, aren't they? Some are local, but most are brought in from Reims by bus. Not every French person likes the resistance. We both know that there are some who approve of the Nazis' ideas. God knows there were plenty of fools in Britain who thought Hitler offered the kind of strong, modernizing government we all needed, although you don't hear much from those people nowadays. Flick shook her head. Percy had not been to occupied France. The French have had 4 years of Nazi rule. Remember, everyone over there is hoping desperately for the invasion. The switchboard girls will keep mum. Even though the RAF bombed them, Flick shrugged, there may be a few hostile ones, but the majority will keep them under control. You hope. Once again, I think it's a chance worth taking. You still don't know how heavily guarded that basement entrance is. That didn't stop us trying yesterday. Yesterday you had 15 resistance fighters, some of them seasoned. Next time, you'll have a handful of dropouts and rejects. Flick played her trump card. Listen, all kinds of things could go wrong. But so what? The operation is low cost, and we're risking the lives of people who aren't contributing to the war effort anyway. What have we got to lose? I was coming to that. Look, I like this plan. I'm going to put it up to the boss, but I think he will reject it, for a reason we haven't yet discussed. What? No one but you could lead this team. But the trip you've just returned from should be your last. You know too much. You've been going in and out for 2 years. You've had contact with most of the resistance circuits in northern France. We can't send you back. If you were captured, you could give them all away. I know, Flick said grimly. That's why I carry a suicide pill. Chapter 8. General Sir Bernard Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group that was about to invade France, had set up improvised headquarters in West London at a school whose pupils had been evacuated to safer accommodations in the countryside. By coincidence, it was the school Monty himself had attended as a boy. Meetings were held in the model room, and everyone sat on the schoolboys' hard wooden benches. Generals and politicians, and, on one famous occasion, the king himself. The Brits thought this was cute. Paul Chancellor from Boston, Massachusetts, thought it was bullshit. What would it have cost them to bring in a few chairs? He liked the British, by and large, but not when they were showing off how eccentric they were. Paul was on Monty's personal staff. A lot of people thought this was because his father was a general, but that was an unfair assumption. Paul was comfortable with senior officers, partly because of his father, partly because before the war, the U.S. Army had been the biggest customer for his business, which was making educational gramophone records, language courses mainly. He liked the military virtues of obedience, punctuality, and precision, but he could think for himself too, and Monty had come to rely on him more and more. His area of responsibility was intelligence. He was an organizer. He made sure the reports Monty needed were on his desk when he wanted them, chased those that came late, set up meetings with key people, and made supplementary inquiries on the boss's behalf. He did have experience of clandestine work. He had been with the Office of Strategic Services, the American Secret Agency, and had served undercover in France and French-speaking North Africa. As a child, he had lived in Paris, where Pa was military attaché at the U.S. Embassy. Paul had been wounded 6 months ago in a shootout with the Gestapo in Marseilles. One bullet had taken off most of his left ear, but harmed nothing other than his looks. The other smashed his right kneecap, which would never be the same again, and that was the real reason he had a desk job. The work was easy by comparison, with living on the run in occupied territory, but never dull. They were planning Operations Overlord, the invasions that would end the war. Paul was one of the few hundred people in the world who knew the date, although many more could guess. In fact, there were 3 possible dates based on the tides, the currents, the moon, and the hours of daylight. The invasion needed a late rising moon, so that the army's initial movements would be shrouded in darkness. But there would be moonlight later, when the first paratroopers jumped from their planes and gliders. A low tide at dawn was necessary to expose the obstacles Rommel had scattered on the beaches, and another low tide before nightfall was needed for the landing of follow-up forces. These requirements left only a narrow window. The fleet could sail next, Monday, June 5th, or on the following Tuesday or Wednesday. The final decisions would be made at the last minute, depending on the weather, by the Allied Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower. 3 years ago, Paul would have been desperately scheming for a place in the invasion force. He would have been itching for action and embarrassed at being a stay-at-home. Now he was older and wiser. For one thing, he had paid his dues. In high school, he had captained the captained the side that won the Massachusetts championship, but he would never again kick a ball with his right foot. More importantly, he knew that his organizational talents could do more to win the war than his ability to shoot straight. He was thrilled to be a part of the team that was planning the greatest invasions of all time. With the thrill came anxiety, of course. Battles never went according to plan, although it was a weakness of Monty's to pretend that his did. Paul knew that any error he made, a slip of the pen, a detail overlooked, a piece of intelligence not double-checked, could kill Allied troops. Despite the huge size of the invasion force, the battle could still go either way, and the smallest of mistakes could tip the balance. Today at 10 a.m., Paul had scheduled 15 minutes on the French resistance. It was Monty's idea. He was nothing if not a detail man. The way to win battles, he believed, was to refrain from fighting until all preparations were in place. At 5 to 10, Simon Fortescue came into the model room. He was one of the senior men at MI6, the Secret Intelligence Department, a tall man in a pinstriped suit. He had a smoothly authoritative manner, but Paul doubted if he knew much about clandestine work in the real world. He was followed by John Graves, a nervous-looking civil servant from the Ministry of Economic Warfare, the government department that oversaw SOE. Graves wore the Whitehall uniform of black jacket and striped gray pants. Paul frowned. He had not invited Graves. "Mr. Graves," he said sharply, "I didn't know you had been asked to join us." "I'll explain in a second," Graves said, and he sat down on a schoolboy bench, looking flustered, and opened his briefcase. Paul was irritated. Monty hated surprises, but Paul could not throw Graves out of the room. A moment later, Monty walked in. He was a small man with a pointed nose and receding hair. His face was deeply lined either side of his close-clipped mustache. He was 56, but looked older. Paul liked him. Monty was so meticulous that some people became impatient with him and called him an old woman. Paul believed that Monty's fussiness saved men's lives. With Monty was an American Paul did not know. Monty introduced him as General Pickford. "Where's the chap from SOE?" Monty snapped, looking at Paul. Graves answered, "I'm afraid he was summoned by the Prime Minister and sends his profound apologies. I hope I'll be able to help." "I doubt it," Monty said crisply. Paul groaned inwardly. It was a snafu, and he would be blamed. But there was something else going on here. The Brits were playing some game he did not know about. He watched them carefully, looking for clues. Simon Fortescue said smoothly, "I'm sure I can fill in the gaps." Monty looked angry. He had promised General Pickford a briefing, and the key person was absent. But he did not waste time on recriminations. In the coming battle, he said, without further ado, the most dangerous moments will be the first. It was unusual for him to speak of dangerous moments. Paul thought his way was to talk as if everything would go like clockwork. We will be hanging by our fingertips from a cliff's edge for a day, or 2 days, Paul said to himself, or a week or more. This will be the enemy's base opportunity. He has only to stamp on our fingers with the heel of his jack boot. So easy, Paul thought. Overlord was the largest military operations in human history. Thousands of boats, hundreds of thousands of men, millions of dollars, tens of millions of bullets. The future of the world depended on the outcome. Yet this vast force could be repelled so easily. If things went wrong in the first few hours, anything we can do to slow the enemy's response will be of crucial importance. Monty finished and he looked at Graves. While S section of SOE has more than 100 agents in France. In fact, virtually all our people are over there, Graves began. And under them, of course, are thousands of French resistance fighters. Over the last few weeks, we have dropped them many hundreds of tons of guns, ammunition, and explosives. It was a bureaucrat's answer. Paul thought. It said everything and nothing. Graves would have gone on, but Monty interrupted with a key question. How effective will they be? The civil servant hesitated, and Fortescue jumped in. My expectations are modest, he said. The performance of SOE is nothing if not uneven. There was a subtext here, Paul knew. The old-time professional spies at MI6 hated the newcomers of SOE with their swashbuckling style. When the resistance struck at German installations, they stirred up Gestapo investigations, which then sometimes caught MI6 people. Paul took SOE's side. Striking at the enemy was the whole point of war. Was that the game here? A bureaucratic spat between MI6 and SOE. Any particular reason for your pessimism? Monty asked Fortescue. Take last night's fiasco, Fortescue replied promptly. A resistance group under an SOE commander attacked a telephone exchange near Reims. General Pickford spoke for the first time. I thought it was our policy not to attack telephone exchanges. We are going to need them ourselves if the invasion is successful. You're quite right, Marty said, but Santa Cecile has been made an exception. It's an access node for the new cable route to Germany. Most of the telephones and telex traffic between the High Command in Berlin and German forces in France passes through that building. Knocking it out wouldn't do us much harm. We won't be calling Germany, but would wreak havoc with the enemy's communications. Pickford said, They'll switch to wireless communications. Exactly, said Monty. Then we'll be able to read their signals. Fortescue put in. Thanks to our code breakers at Bletchley. Paul knew, though not many other people did, that British intelligence had cracked the codes used by the Germans and therefore could read much of the enemy's radio traffic. MI6 was proud of this, although in truth they deserved little credit. The work had been done not by intelligence staff, but by an irregular group of mathematicians and crossword puzzles enthusiasts, many of whom would have been arrested if they had entered an MI6 office in normal times. Sir Stuart Menzies, the fox-hunting head of MI6, hated intellectuals, communists, and homosexuals. But Alan Turing, the mathematician genius who led the codebreakers, was all three. However, Pickford was right. If the Germans could not use the phone lines, they would have to use radio, and then the Allies would know what they were saying. Destroying the telephone exchange at Saint-Cecile would give the Allies a crucial advantage. But the mission had gone wrong. Who was in charge? Monty asked. Graves said, I haven't seen a full report. I can tell you, Fortescue interjected. Major Clariette. He paused. A girl? Paul had heard of Felicity Claret. She was something of a legend among the small group who knew the secret of the Allies' clandestine war. She had survived undercover in France longer than anyone. Her code name was Leopardus, and people said she moved around the streets of occupied France with the silent footsteps of a dangerous cat. They also said she was a pretty girl with a heart of stone. She had killed more than once. And what happened, Monty said? Poor planning. An inexperienced commander and a lack of discipline among the men. All played their part, Fortescue replied. The building was not heavily guarded, but the Germans there are trained troops, and they simply wiped out the resistance force. Marty looked angry. Pickford said, Looks like we shouldn't rely too heavily on the French resistance to disrupt Romel's supply lines. Fortescue nodded. Bombing is the more reliable means to that end. I'm not sure that's quite fair, Graves protested feebly. Bomber Command has its successes and failures too, and SOE is a good deal cheaper. We're not here to be fair to people, for God's sake, Marty growled. We just want to win the war. He stood up. I think we've heard enough, he said to General Pickford. Graves said, But what shall we do about the telephone exchange? SOE has come up with a new plan. Good God, Fortescue interrupted. We don't want another balls up, do we? Bomb it, said Monty. We've tried that, Graves said. They hit the building, but the damage was not sufficient to put the telephone exchange out of action for longer than a few hours. Then bomb it again, said Monty, and he walked out. Graves threw a look of petulant fury at the man from MI6. Really, Fortescue, he said. I mean to say, really. Fortescue did not respond. They all left the room. In the hallway outside, two people were waiting. A man of about 50 in a tweed jacket and a short blonde woman wearing a worn blue cardigan over a faded cotton dress, standing in front of a display of sporting trophies. They looked almost like a head teacher chatting to a schoolgirl, except that the girl wore a bright yellow scarf tied with a touch of style that looked, to Paul, distinctly French. Fortescue hurried past them, but Graves stopped. "They turned you down," he said. "They're going to bomb it again." Paul guessed that the woman was the leopardess, and he looked at her with interest. She was small and slim, with curly blonde hair cut short, and Paul noticed rather lovely green eyes. He would not have called her pretty. Her face was too grown up for that. The initial schoolgirl impression was fleeting. There was an aggressive look to her straight nose and chisel-shaped chin, and there was something sexy about her, something that made Paul think about the slight body under that shabby dress. She reacted with indignation to Graves' statement. "There's no point in bombing the place from the air. The basement is reinforced. For God's sake, why did they make that decision?" "Perhaps you should ask these gentlemen," Graves said, turning to Paul. "Major Chancellor meet Majors Clariette and Colonel Thright." Paul was annoyed at being put in the position of defending someone else's decisions. Caught off guard, he replied with undiplomatic frankness. "I don't see that there's much to explain," he said briskly. "You screwed up and you're not being given a second chance." The woman glared up at him. She was a foot shorter than he, and spoke angrily. "Screwed up," she said. "What the hell do you mean by that?" Paul felt himself flush. Maybe General Montgomery was misinformed, but wasn't this the first time you had commanded an action of this kind, Major? Is that what you've been told? That it was my lack of experience? She was beautiful, he saw now. Anger made her eyes wide and her cheeks pink. But she was being very rude, so he decided to give it to her with both barrels. That and poor planning. There was nothing wrong with the damn plan. And the fact that trained troops were defending the place against an undisciplined force. "You arrogant pig." Paul took an involuntary step back. He had never been spoken to this way by a woman. She may be 5'0", he thought, but I bet she scares the damn Nazis. Looking at her furious face, he realized that she was most angry with herself. "You think it's your fault?" he said. "No one gets this mad about other people's mistakes." It's her turn to be taken aback. Her mouth dropped open, and she was speechless. Colonel Thright spoke for the first time. "Calm down, Flick, for God's sake," he said, turning to Paul. He went on, "Let me guess. This account was given to you by Simon Fortescue of MI6, was it not?" "That's correct," Paul said stiffly. "Did he mention that the attack plan was based on intelligence supplied by his organization?" "I don't believe he did." "I thought not," said Thright. "Thank you, Major. I don't need to trouble you any further." Paul did not feel the conversation was really over, but he had been dismissed by a senior officer, and he had no choice but to walk away. He had obviously got caught in the crossfire of a turf war between MI6 and SOE. He felt most angry with Fortescue, who had used the meeting to score points. He had Monty made the right decision in choosing to bomb the telephone exchange rather than let SOE have another go at it? Paul was not sure. As he turned into his own office, he glanced back. Major Clariette was still arguing with Colonel Threat, her voice low but her face animated, expressing outrage with large gestures. She stood like a man, hand on hip, leaning forward, making a point with a belligerent forefinger. But all the same, there was something enchanting about her. Paul wondered what it would be like to hold her in his arms, and run his hands over her lithe body. Although she's tough, he thought, she's all woman. But was she right? Was bombing futile? He decided to ask some more questions. Chapter 9. The vast, sooty bulk of the cathedral loomed over the center of Reims, like a divine reproach. Dieter Frank's sky-blue Hispano Suiza pulled up at midday, outside the Hotel Frankfurt, taken over by the German occupiers. Dieter got out and glanced up at the stubby twin towers of the great church. The original medieval design had featured elegant pointed spires, which had never been built for lack of money. So mundane, obstacles frustrated the holiest of aspirations. Tito told Lieutenant Hess to drive to the chateau at Saint-Cecile and make sure the Gestapo were ready to cooperate. He did not want to risk being repulsed a second time by Major Reber. As he drove off, and Dieter went up to the suite where he had left Stephanie last night. She got up from her chair as he walked in. He drank in the welcome sight. Her red hair fell on bare shoulders, and she wore a chestnut silk negligee and high-heeled slippers. He kissed her hungrily and ran his hands over her slim body, grateful for the gift of her beauty. "How nice that you're so pleased to see me," she said, with a smile. They spoke French together as always. Dieter inhaled the scent of her. "Well, you smell better than Hans Hees, especially when he's been up all night." She brushed his hair back with a soft hand. "You always make fun, but you wouldn't have protected Hans with your own body." "True," he sighed, and let her go. "Christ, I'm tired. Come to bed." He shook his head. "I have to interrogate the prisoners. He's coming back for me in an hour." He slumped on the couch. "I'll get you something to eat." She pressed the bell, and a minute later an elderly French waiter tapped at the door. Stephanie knew Dieter well enough to order for him. She asked for a plate of ham with warm rolls and potato salad. "Some wine?" she asked him. "No, it'll send me to sleep." "A pot of coffee, then," she told the waiter. When the men had gone, she sat on the couch beside Dieter and took his hand. Did everything go according to plan? Yes. Rommel was quite complimentary to me. He frowned anxiously. I just hope I can live up to the promise I made him. I'm sure you realize she did not ask for details. She knew he would tell her as much as he wanted to and no more. He looked fondly at her, wondering whether to say what was on his mind. It might spoil the pleasant atmosphere, but it needed to be said. He sighed again. If the invasion is successful and the Allies win back France, it would be the end for you and me. You know that. She winced, as if at a sudden pain, and let go of his hand. Do I? He knew that her husband had been killed earlier in the war, and they had had no children. Do you have any family at all? He asked her. My parents died years ago. I have a sister in Montreal. Maybe we should be thinking about how to send you over there. She shook her head. No. Why? She would not meet his eyes. I just wish the war would be over, she muttered. No, you don't. She showed a weird flash of irritation. Of course I do. How uncharacteristically conventional of you, he said with a hint of scorn. You can't possibly think war is a good thing. You and I would not be together were it not for the war. But what about all the suffering? I'm an existentialist. War enables people to be what they really are. The sadists become torturers. The psychopaths make brave frontline troops. The bullies and the victims alike have scope to play their roles to the hilt, and the whores are always busy. She looked angry. That tells me pretty clearly what part I play. He stroked her soft cheek and touched her lips with the tip of his finger. You're a courtesan, and very good at it. She moved her head away. You don't mean any of this. You're improvising on a tune the way you do when you sit at the piano. He smiled and nodded. He could play a little jazz, much to his father's dismay. The analogy was apt. He was trying out ideas rather than expressing a firm conviction. Perhaps you're right. Her anger evaporated, and she looked sad. Did you mean the part about us separating if the Germans leave France? He put his arms around her shoulders and pulled her to him. She relaxed and laid her head on his chest. He kissed the top of her head and stroked her hair. It's not going to happen, he said. Are you certain? I guarantee it. It was the second time today he had made a promise he might not be able to keep. The waiter returned with his lunch, and the spell was broken. Dieter was almost too tired to be hungry, but he ate a few mouthfuls and drank all the coffee. Afterwards, he washed up and shaved, and then he felt better. As he was buttoning a clean uniform shirt, Lieutenant Heath tapped at the door. Dieter kissed Stephanie and went out. The car was diverted around a blocked street. There had been another bombing raid overnight, and a whole row of houses near the railway station had been destroyed. They got out of town and headed for Saint-Cecile. Dieter had told Rommel that the interrogation of the prisoners might enable him to cripple the resistance before the invasion. But Rommel, like any military commander, took a maybe for a promise and would now expect results. Unfortunately, there was nothing guaranteed about an interrogation. Clever prisoners told lies that were impossible to check. Some found ingenious ways to kill themselves before the torture became unbearable. As security was really tight in their particular resistance circuit, each would know only the minimum about the others and have little information of value. Worst of all, they might have been fed false information by the perfidious allies, so that when they finally broke under torture, what they said was part of a deception plan. Dito began to put himself in the mood. He needed to be completely hard-hearted and calculating. He must not allow himself to be touched by the physical and mental suffering he was about to inflict on human beings. All that mattered was whether it worked. He closed his eyes and felt a profound calm settle over him, a familiar bone-deep chill that he sometimes thought must be like the cold of death itself. The car pulled into the grounds of the chateau. Workmen were repairing the smashed glass in the windows and filling the holes made by grenades. In the ornate hall, the telephonists murmured into their microphones in a perpetual undertone. Dita marched through the perfectly proportioned rooms of the East Ring with Hans Hees in tow. They went down the stairs to the fortified basement. The sentry at the door saluted and made no attempt to detain Dita, who was in uniform. He found the door marked Interrogation Center and went in. In the outer room, Willy Rieber sat at the table. Dita barked Heil Hitler and saluted, forcing Rieber to stand. Then Dita pulled out a chair, sat down and said, "Please be seated, Major." Rieber was furious at being invited to sit in his own headquarters, but he had no choice. Dita said, "How many prisoners do we have?" "3." Dita was disappointed. "So few." "We killed 8 of the enemy in the skirmish. 2 more died of their wounds overnight." Data grunted with dismay. He had ordered that the wounded would be kept alive, but there was no point now in questioning Rieber about their treatment. Rieber went on. "I believe 2 escaped." "Yes," Dita said. "The woman in the square and the man she carried away." "Exactly. So from a total of 15 attackers, we have 3 prisoners." Where are they?" Rieber looked shifty. 2 are in their cells." Dita narrowed his eyes. "And the 3rd?" Rieber inclined his head towards the inner room. "The 3rd is under interrogation at this moment." Dita got up, apprehensive, and opened the door. The hunched figure of Sergeant Becker stood just inside the room, holding in his hand a wooden club like a large policeman's truncheon. He was sweating and breathing hard, as if he had been taking vigorous exercise. He was staring at the prisoner who was tied to a post. Dita looked at the prisoner, and his fears were confirmed. Despite his self-imposed calm, he grimaced with revulsion. The prisoner was the young woman, Genevieve, who had carried a Sten gun under her coat. She was naked, tied to the pillar by a rope that passed under her arms and supported her slumped weight. Her face was so swollen that she could not have opened her eyes. Blood from her mouth covered her chin and most of her chest. Her body was discolored with angry bruises. One arm hung at an odd angle, apparently dislocated at the shoulder. Her pubic hair was matted with blood. Data said to Becca, What has she told you?" Becca looked embarrassed. "Nothing." Data nodded, suppressing his rage. It was as he had expected. He went close to the woman. "Genevieve, listen to me," he said in French. She showed no sign of having heard. "Would you like to rest now?" he tried. There was no response. He turned around. Weber was standing in the doorway, looking defiant. Dita, coldly furious, said, "You were expressively told that I would conduct the interrogation." "We were ordered to give you access," Weber replied, with smug pedantry. We were not prohibited from questioning the prisoners ourselves." Are you satisfied with the results you have achieved?" Weber did not answer. Dita said, "What about the other two?" "We have not yet begun their interrogation." "Thank God for that." Dita was nonetheless dismayed. He had expected half a dozen subjects not due. "Take me to them." Weber nodded at Becca, who put down his club and led the way out of the room. In the bright lights of the corridor, Dita could see the bloodstains on Becca's uniform. The sergeant stopped at the door with a Judas peephole. Dita slid back the panel and looked inside. It was a bare room with a dirt floor. The only item of furniture was a bucket in the corner. Two men sat on the ground, not talking, staring into space. Dita studied them carefully. He had seen both yesterday. The older one was Gaston, who had set the charges. He had a large piece of sticking plaster covering a scalp wound that looked superficial. The other was very young, about 17, and Dita recalled that his name was Bertrand. He had no visible injuries, but Dita, recalling the skirmish, thought he might have been stunned by the explosion of a hand grenade. Dita watched them for a while, taking time to think. He had to do this right. He could not afford to waste another captive. These two were the only assets left. The kid would be scared, he foresaw, but might withstand a lot of pain. The other was too old for serious torture. He might die before he cracked, but he would be soft-hearted. Dita began to see a strategy for interrogating them. He closed the Judas and returned to the interview room. Becca followed, reminding him again of a stupid but dangerous dog. Dita said, "Sergeant Becca, untie the woman and put her in the cell with the other two." Weber protested. "A woman in a man's cell?" Dita stared at him incredulously. "Do you think she will feel the indignity?" Becca went into the torture chamber and re-emerged, carrying the broken body of Genevieve. Dita said, "Make sure the old man gets a good look at her, then bring him here." Becca went out. Dita decided he would prefer to get rid of Weber. However, he knew that if he gave a direct order, Weber would resist. So he said, "I think you should remain here to witness the interrogation. You could learn a lot from my techniques." As Dieter had expected, Weber did the opposite. "I don't think so," he said. "Becker can keep me informed." Dieter faked an indignant expression, and Weber went out. Dieter caught the eye of Lieutenant Hess, who had quietly taken a seat in the corner. Hess understood how Dieter had manipulated Weber, and was looking admiringly at Dieter. Dieter shrugged. "Sometimes it's too easy," he said. Becker returned with Gaston. The older man was pale. No doubt he had been badly shocked by the sight of Genevieve. Dieter said in German, "Please have a seat. Do you like to smoke?" Gaston looked blank. That established that he did not understand German, which was worth knowing. Dieter motioned him to a seat and offered him cigarettes and matches. Gaston took a cigarette and lit it with shaking hands. Some prisoners broke at this stage, before torture, just from fear of what would happen. Dieter hoped that might be the case today. He had shown Gaston the alternatives. On one hand, the dreadful sight of Genevieve, on the other, cigarettes and kindness. Now he spoke in French, using a friendly tone. "I am going to ask you some questions." "I don't know anything," Gaston said. "Oh, I think you'll do it," Dieter said. "You're in your 60s, and you have probably lived in or around Reims all your life." Gaston did not deny this. Dieter went on. "I realized that the members of a resistance cell use code names and give one another the minimum of personal information as a security precaution." Gaston involuntarily gave a slight nod of agreement. But he'd known most of these people for decades. A man may call himself elephant or priest or aubergine when the resistance meet, but you know his face, and you recognize him as Jean-Pierre, the postman who lives in the Rue du Parc, and surreptitiously visits the widow Montagu on Tuesday when his wife thinks he is playing bowls. Gaston looked away, unwilling to meet Dieter's eyes, confirming that Dieter was right. Dieter went on. "I want you to understand that you are in control of everything that happens here. Pain or the relief of pain. The sentence of death or reprieve. All depends on your choices." He saw with satisfaction that Gaston looked even more terrified. "You will answer my questions," he went on. "Everyone does in the end. The only imponderable is how soon." This was the moment when a man might break down, but Gaston did not. "I can't tell you anything," he said in a near whisper. He was scared, but he still had some courage left, and he was not going to give up without a fight. Dieter shrugged. "It was to be the hard way, then." He spoke to Becker in German. "Go back to the cell. Make the boy strip naked. Bring him here and tie him to the pillar in the next room." "Very good, Major," Becker said eagerly. Dieter turned back to Gaston. "You're going to tell me the names and code names of all the men and women who were with you yesterday, and any others in your resistance circuit. Gaston shook his head, but Dieter ignored that. I want to know the address of every member and of every house used by members of the circuit. Gaston drew hard on his cigarette and stared at the glowing end. In fact, these were not the most important questions. Dieter's main aim was to get information that would lead him to other resistance circuits, but he did not want Gaston to know that. A moment later, Becca returned with Bertrand. Gaston stared open-mouthed at the naked boy, was marched through the interview room into the chamber beyond. Dieter stood up. He said to Hess, "Keep an eye on this old man." Then he followed Becca into the torture chamber. He was careful to leave the door a little ajar so that Gaston could hear everything. Becca tied Bertrand to the pillar. Before Dieter could intervene, Becca punched Bertrand in the stomach. It was a powerful blow from a strong man. It made a sickening thud. The young man groaned and writhed in agony. "No, no, no," Dieter said, as he had expected. Becca's approach was completely unscientific. A strong young man could withstand being punched almost indefinitely. First you blindfold him. He produced a large cotton bandana from his pocket and tied it over Bertrand's eyes. This way, every blow comes as a dreadful shock, and every moment between blows is an agony of anticipation. Becca picked up his wooden club. Dieter nodded, and Becca swung the club, hitting the side of the victim's head. With a loud crack of solid wood on skin and bone, Bertrand cried out in pain and fear. "No, no," Dieter said again. "Never hit the head. You may dislocate the jaw, preventing the subject from speaking. Worse, you may damage the brain. Then nothing he says will be of any value." He took the wooden club from Becca and replaced it in the umbrella stand. From the selection of weapons, there he chose a steel crowbar and handed it to Becca. "Now remember, the object is to inflict unbearable agony without endangering the subject's life or his ability to tell us what we need to know. Avoid vital organs. Concentrate on the bony parts, ankles, shins, kneecaps, fingers, elbows, shoulders, ribs." A crafty look came over Becca's face. He walked around the pillar, then, taking careful aim, struck hard at Bertrand's elbow with a steel bar. The boy gave a scream of real agony, a sound Dieter recognized. Becca looked pleased. "God forgive me," Dieter thought, "for teaching this brute how to inflict pain more efficiently." On Dieter's orders, Becca struck at Bertrand's bony shoulder, then his hand, then his ankle. Dieter made Becca pause between blows, allowing just enough time for the pain to ease slightly, and for the subject to begin to dread the next stroke. Bertrand began to appeal for mercy. "No more, please," he implored, hysterical with pain and fear. Becca raised the crowbar, but Dieter stopped him. He wanted the begging to go on. "Please don't hit me again," Bertrand cries. "Please, please." Dieter said to Becca, "It is often a good idea to break a leg early in the interview. The pain is quite excruciating, especially when the broken bones is struck again." He selected a sledgehammer from the umbrella stand, Just below the knee, he said, handing it to Becca. As hard as you can. Becca took careful aim and swung mightily. The crack as the shin broke was loud enough to hear, but Trent screamed and fainted. Becca picked up a bucket of water that stood in a corner and threw the water in Bertrand's face. The young man came to and screamed again. Eventually the scream subsided to heart-rending groans. "What do you want?" Bertrand implored. "Please tell me what you want from me." Dieter did not ask him any questions. Instead, he handed the steel crowbar to Becca and pointed to the broken leg, where a jagged right edge of bone stuck through the flesh. Becca struck the leg at the point. Bertrand screamed and passed out again. Dieter thought that might be enough. He went into the next room. Gaston sat where Dieter had left him, but he was a different man. He was bent over in his chair, face in his hands, crying with great sobs, moaning and praying to God. Dieter knelt in front of him and prized his hands away from his wet face. Gaston looked at him. Through tears, Dieter said softly, "Only you can make it stop. Please stop it, please," Gaston moaned. "Will you answer my questions?" There was a pause. Bertrand screamed again. "Yes," Gaston yelled. Yes, I'll tell you everything. If you just stop." Dieter raised his voice. "Sergeant Becca." "Yes, Major." "No more for now." "Yes, Major." Becca sounded disappointed. Dieter reverted to French. "Now, Gaston, let's begin with the leader of the circuit. Name and code name. Who is he?" Gaston hesitated. Dieter looked toward the open door of the torture chamber. Gaston quickly said, "Michael Clariette, codename Monette." It was the breakthrough. The first name was the hardest. The rest would follow effortlessly. Concealing his satisfaction, Dieter gave Gaston a cigarette and held a match. "Where does he live?" "In Reims." Gaston blew out smoke, and his shaking began to subside. He gave an address near the cathedral. Dieter nodded to Lieutenant Hess, who took out a notebook and began to record Gaston's responses. Patiently, Dieter took Gaston through each member of the attack team. In a few cases, Gaston knew only the codenames, and there were two men he claimed never to have seen before. Sunday. Dieter believed him. There had been two getaway drivers waiting a short distance away. Gaston said, "A young woman called Gilbert and a man codenamed Marcal. There were others in the group, which was known as the Bollinger Circuit." Dieter asked about relationships between resistance members. Were there any love affairs? Were any of them homosexuals? Was anyone sleeping with someone else's wife? Although the torture had stopped, Bertrand continued to groan and sometimes scream with the agony of his wounds. And now Gaston said, "Is he going to be looked after?" Dieter shrugged. "Please get a doctor for him." "Very well. When we have finished our talks." Gaston told Dieter that Michael and Gilbert were lovers, even though Michael was married to Flick, the blonde girl in the square. So far, Gaston had been talking about a circuit that was mostly destroyed, so his information had been mainly of academic interest. Now Dita moved on to more important questions. When Allied agents come to this district, how do they make contact? No one was supposed to know how that was handled, Gaston said. There was a cutout, however. He knew part of the story. The agents were met by a woman codenamed Burgess. Gaston did not know where she met them, but she took them to her home. Then she passed them on to Michael. No one had ever met Burgess, not even Michael. Dita was disappointed that Gaston knew so little about the woman. But that was the idea of a cutout. Do you know where she lives? Gaston nodded. One of the agents gave it away. She has a house in the Rue de Bois, number 11. Dita tried not to look jubilant. This was a key fact. The enemy would probably send more agents in an attempt to rebuild the Bollinger Circuit. Dita might be able to catch them at the safe house. And when they leave, they were picked up by a plane in a field codenamed Champ de Priere. Actually a pasture near the village of Châtel. Gaston revealed there was an alternative landing field, codenamed Champ d'Or, but he did not know where it was. Dita asked Gaston about liaisons with London, who had ordered the attack on the telephone exchange. Gaston explained that Flick, Major Clariette, was the circuit's commanding officer, and she had brought orders from London. Dita was intrigued. A woman in command, but he had seen her courage under fire. She would make a good leader. In the next room, Bertrand began to pray aloud for death to come. Please, Gaston said, a doctor. Just tell me about Major Clariette, Dita said. Then I'll get someone to give Bertrand an injection. She is a very important person, Gaston said, eager now to give Dita information that would satisfy him. They say she has survived longer than anyone else under cover. She has been all over northern France. Dita was spellbound. She had contact with different circuits, so I believe. That was unusual, and it meant she could be a fountain of information about the French resistance. Dita said, she got away yesterday after the skirmish. Where do you think she went? Back to London, I'm sure, Gaston said, to report on the raid. Dita cursed silently. He wanted her in France, where he could catch her and interrogate her. If he got his hands on her, he could destroy half of the French resistance, as he had promised. But she was out of reach. He stood up. That's all for now, he said. Hans, get a doctor for the prisoners. I don't want any of them to die today. They may have more to tell us. Then type up your notes and bring them to me in the morning. Very good, Major. Make a copy for Major Reber. But don't give it to him until I say so. Understood. I'll drive myself back to the hotel. Dita went out. The headache began as he stepped into the open air. Rubbing his forehead with his hand, he made his way into the car and drove out of the village, heading for Reims. The afternoon sun seemed to reflect off the road surface straight into his eyes. These migraines often struck him after an interrogation. In an hour he would be blind and helpless. He had to get back to the hotel before the attack reached its peak. Reluctant to break, he sounded his horn constantly. Vineyard workers making their slow way home scattered out of his path. Horses swerved and a cart was driven into the ditch. His eyes watered with the pain and he felt nauseous. He reached the town without crashing the car. He managed to steer into the center, outside the Hotel Frankfurt. He did not so much park the car as abandon it. Staggering inside, he made his way to the seat. Stephanie knew immediately what had happened. While he stripped off his uniform, tunic, and shirt, she got the field medical kit out of her suitcase and filled the syringe with the morphine mixture. Dieter fell on the bed and she plunged the needle into his arm. Almost immediately, the pain eased. Stephanie lay back down beside him, stroking his face with gentle fingertips. A few moments later, Dieter was unconscious.